Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator at Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to welcome this evening Dr. Jeannine Jannot, author of The Disintegrating Student, Struggling But Smart, Falling Apart, and How to Turn It Around. I was talking in the green room. I am personally excited for this book. I have two small children, and my goal as a mother is to do slightly better than my own parents. I had wonderful parents. This is no shade on them, but I was the gifted student. And when I started to struggle, they were like, well, she'll be fine. She's always been fine before. I was not fine. And I mean, and I pulled it out, but it would have been better if they had known what to look for and what to do to help, ways to help, because this is still fairly new. It used to be like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's like, it would have been nice if someone had reached a hand down and helped me up just a step. This is a very difficult year for students. It was a difficult year last year. There's all sorts of new challenges that our students are facing. And it's going to be a tough year for pretty much everybody. So I think this is going to be a wonderful book. To our event attendees at home, we will be taking questions. So please do put them in the chat sidebar or in the Q&A function. We will be asking those questions later on. But tonight we are ready to welcome Dr. Jeannine Jannot. Please do tell me, welcome to Gibson's Bookstore. Tell me a little bit about your book.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for letting me talk about my book. And mostly, I just want to talk about our kids that are struggling. I'm a mom of three. I'm kind of at the other end of the spectrum from you. I've got my youngest is 18. So I have 18, 23, and 25 right now. So my youngest just graduated high school and is off to college. And I wrote the book to help all kids who are struggling. And when our kids are struggling, parents are struggling, and the people who care about the kids, teachers. And so that was my goal, was to put something together that could be a good resource and start a good conversation.
So you have a presentation. Do you want to leap right into it?
I sure can. Let's see here. Let me share this. Oh, not that. There we go. All right. So I mentioned that I really didn't intend to write a book, so I'm not your typical author. I actually have my youngest she's been writing since she's been in second grade, and so she just loves to write. She's written several novels, all unfinished, but she's got that passion. And I wrote a book because it was very situational. So it wasn't something I aspired to do so much as it just needed to happen. And how it happened was when I was raising my three kids, there was one point, this was about 10 years ago, where my youngest was in elementary school. My middle child was in middle school. My oldest was in high school. And I just started teaching college. And so I had this amazing bird's eye view of the education system and our kids' response to it. And what I was seeing was so much anxiety. In my community, I live in the northern suburbs outside of Atlanta. We were going through suicide clusters in our high schools. It was just a very, very dark time for students. And with my kids being across those ages, those grades, I was just seeing so much of it. And I had the concern of seeing these college students walking in my classroom, and they were overwhelmed. They lacked so many skills that they really should have had: time management, organization, stress management, good sleep habits. There was just a lot of stuff going on with them. And they also hadn't retained much from high school. So I was teaching psychology courses. So like in my intro psych class, I'd have students who took AP Psych in high school, and here they were, nothing. They couldn't remember anything. And they may have gotten an A. So I really just became passionate about what can I do? Personally, I was trying to do it with my own kids, their friends. And I started a coaching business where I work with students and parents to try to address the issues so that these students can kind of get back on track. And in doing that, that's when I kind of discovered what I can now call the disintegrating student. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what I discovered in my coaching and what I'm still discovering in my coaching. And I hope that, if you're a parent or a teacher listening, that, if this resonates with you, you can kind of see why we are where we are today with our kids. And most importantly, I want to kind of end with, here's how we can help as the adults in our kids' lives. So one of the first things I do when I talk to parents is like kind of prime them to think about what's the stuff that keeps you up at night about your kids. And it's going to depend on the age of your children, but certainly as your kids start hitting, above third grade, really these days, you kind of start worrying about grades, their motivation, and particularly that's, middle school, high school. Our kids, sometimes all of a sudden, that motivation switch seems to turn off. We worry about our kids' study habits. Maybe they don't have any at all, like they don't study. They may develop a negative attitude towards school. We worry that they're too stressed, they're not getting enough sleep, they're on their screens constantly. Most of our kids don't have good or helpful time management strategies or even kind of a good relationship with time. So procrastination is a huge issue. Many kids are disorganized around lots of things, but particularly their schoolwork. And, when we throw virtual learning in and things like that, it became even more complicated. One thing I hear from parents a whole lot is, I feel like I'm becoming one of those helicopter parents and I really don't want to. So, when we are worried about micromanaging everything for our kids, but yet we're concerned about the consequences if we don't, that's something that can certainly weigh on us. And if you're micromanaging, and even if you're not, the power struggles that start to ensue when we start interacting with our kids around school, particularly when the stakes start getting higher, middle school, high school. So that's obviously problematic. What I've discovered working with students, and being a parent myself and kind of living and breathing all this, is that it's not our kids and it's not us. It's us in what our achievement culture has become. And I really go into this quite a bit as the book as to where our achievement, how we got to where we are, this achievement culture. And what I mean by achievement culture is like, how are we defining educational success? How are we viewing success? And the reality is, it is a very data-driven definition at this point. So we care about, and I'm talking about the kids, the teachers, the parents, all the stakeholders. What we care about are the grades, the GPA, the standardized test scores when they get older. Once those kids hit late middle school into high school, they're worried about class rank, if that's something their high school still does. Some have finally stopped doing that. What colleges they're applying to, what colleges they're getting accepted to. And all of this is a check the box mentality. So our kids go to school thinking about, what do I need to do? What box do I need to check to get this grade, to get this data point, to get this next thing, to add this on my resume? And it's check the box, check the box, check the box. And they feel like data points. We treat them like data points. And what's happened is, learning is really not part of the equation anymore. And we have this sort of failure is not an option kind of subtext to that, where our kids do not feel like it's okay or safe to make mistakes. So I'm going to talk about how that ends up playing into these disintegrating students. But this is not a good place to be. And I talk about, when I would teach social psychology, I always talked about culture in the context of fish and water. When you're in a culture, whatever culture that is, and we're in layers of cultures. So we have the achievement culture, but we have, ethnic cultures, religious cultures. I'm in a Southern culture down here in Atlanta. Those cultures influence us at a level we don't really recognize, like a fish in water, unless the water is something's wrong with it, or it's toxic, or it's the wrong temperature, we don't notice it. But it is impacting our attitudes, our beliefs, and our assumptions. So our behavior is a direct result of the culture that we're in. So I think this is like the most important thing to understand. This is what's driving all the struggle in our children, is the culture that they're, and we as parents are immersed in. There it is. So this isn't much of a surprise at this point. Research is now starting to validate what many of us have long suspected was the issue. I mean, 8-10 years ago, I was saying this, and that is that these kids who are in high achieving schools are at risk for mental health issues, and they're at risk at the same rate, at the same level as children who live in poverty, who live in foster care, have incarcerated parents, or recently immigrated. And that rate is 3 to 4 times the national rate. So it's pretty significant and concerning. And this study, came out before the pandemic. There's been more research since then, and my sense is the pandemic made everything even worse, because a lot of these high achieving kids were thrown a huge wrench when remote learning happened. And so this is kind of where we are as a result of being in the achievement culture, and it's a real problem. So, okay, so we've established the achievement culture is kind of the root cause, but then what happens? What is a disintegrating student? So I coined the term because I was seeing this client that I did not expect to see when I started academic coaching. And it was this really high achieving, oftentimes identified gifted kid who had always, kind of easy breezy through school. This kind of kid in elementary school who'd show up for class, pretty much got their work done on the bus or in class, didn't have to study as long as they heard the information, they could turn around and just get an A on all the tests. So really, really easy to teach, really, they liked learning, and it wasn't very difficult. And they didn't really have to put a lot of effort in. And what happens is these kids hit what I call a rigor tipping point. And not every high achiever becomes a disintegrating student, but I will tell you, an astonishingly large number are becoming disintegrating students. It's more common than I ever would have imagined. But there are students, and I'll kind of share what's the secret sauce for the students who don't disintegrate. But the rigor tipping point. So in the book on page 5, I write that as students encounter more and significantly more difficult schoolwork, they inevitably reach a point where they can no longer manage it easily. And I call this the rigor tipping point. As grades begin to drop, negatively affecting their attitude and self-esteem, it creates a perfect storm of external and internal pressures, which causes some of the best and brightest students to fall apart. So this rigor tipping point is this point where the challenge, the rigor, the responsibilities, all the things kind of come at a student all at once. They hit this wall where just being really smart and just being really intelligent isn't enough to compensate for the amount of rigor and challenge they're experiencing. And when that happens, things start to crack. And typically the first sign is, the grades start to become inconsistent and then maybe just start to decline. So what ends up happening at this point, if a kid starts to hit this rigor tipping point, the grades start to, go down. A parent says, "Hey, what's going on? Why'd you get that C? What's happening?" And the kid will say, "I don't know." And they're not lying. They really don't know what's going on. They're completely freaked out about it, but they don't understand. And here's where things start to get pretty complicated at that family level, because there's a whole cycle of misunderstanding and miscommunication that start to happen between parents and tweens and teens who are hitting this rigor tipping point, which can happen anytime, but I see it very commonly around 8th grade, 10th grade, first semester or so of college. Around here, we, over the last several years, have been pushing rigor downward into middle school so that the 7th and 8th graders can take high school classes. And once we did that, I started seeing 9th grade being this just overwhelming tipping point for a lot of really bright kids, because they were coming in as freshmen, new to high school, and they were taking 10th and 11th grade classes, and they just didn't have the capacity to do that. They didn't have the skills to support it. So when the misunderstanding and miscommunication between the parents and the child happens because we're telling two different stories in our heads. So parents' assumptions that are driving the story in their head is, okay, my kid doesn't care anymore. They're just lazy. They're unmotivated. And because our first instinct as a parent is like, well, what can I do to help? Do you need a tutor? Can I get you some extra resources? So we're offering stuff to help solve this problem. Let's talk to the teacher, blah, blah, blah. And the kid usually is like, no, I don't want that. So the parent assumes that the kid is in control of this, that the kid is deciding not to do well. Now, what's going on inside the kid's head is the thing I hear the most is my parents care more about my grades than they do me. I always just feel so bad when I hear that, because first of all, I know it's not true. I know that's just not the case. But over the years, I've heard it so many times, and I've spent so much time trying to figure out why they think this. And it became quite clear why, just through my own life experience. It's because that's all we talk about. I mean, the majority of the stuff that we say to our kids, particularly as they get in those upper grades, is academic related. Have you done your homework? What you get on that test? The minute they walk in the door, did you turn that thing in? How did the test go? Did you talk to the teacher? We get so anxious about the thing that we're worried about with academics for them, because we're worried about how it's going to impact them. But then we end up offloading our anxiety onto them, and they hear it so much that they really do feel like that seems to be the thing that you care about the most, because you talk to me the most about it. Kids really, really worry that they're disappointing their parents. That usually comes as a surprise to parents, because they act like they don't care. They act a little bit like they might be enjoying how upset we're getting, but they really do worry that they're disappointing us. And from a really kind of personal place with the students, they are petrified that they're no longer smart, because most of these kids have identified and internalized, I'm a smart kid, maybe the smartest in my class, and all of a sudden I'm getting this feedback that maybe I'm not so smart. So that just disrupts everything, and self-esteem takes a huge hit when that's happening. And the other thing, because it's embarrassing to admit this to anybody, they think it's just them. They have no idea that there's probably several of their peers experiencing the same thing. So unfortunately, this is sort of the bad news, that this is where a lot of families find themselves kind of in this position. But the good news, and this is like the big part of my book, is like, okay, introducing what's the bad news and what's a disintegrating child. But the good news is there's actually a lot we can do to help our kids. So in working with students, I identified 7 areas of skill deficits and counterproductive behaviors that are really what's causing the child to disintegrate. So organization. So most of these kids don't have great organization around school, sometimes even their thinking. So a lot of these students might have ADHD. Or a learning disability. And so there's other issues, if they're neuroatypical, that are negatively impacting their school performance too. Time management. again, there's no reason to expect a kid to have a good working time management system before about 7th, 8th grade, because that's when their brain can actually have a time horizon and they can start actually planning. So they need a lot of support up until that point. So those agendas we give them, so well intentioned, don't tend to work. They work for 2 days and then they forget about them. These kids, a lot of them don't have study habits and study skills that support learning. Many of them don't study at all. If they've been really smart all their life, they may have gotten away with never really having to study. And then when they're put in this position of like, okay, I can no longer just show up and get the A, they don't know where to start. One of the biggest issues is their mindset. And mindset is just, it's kind of a default way of thinking about something. So again, it's going to drive, kind of like a culture does, it drives our thinking, our behavior, our assumptions. And the mindset that's of interest here is the mindset around how intelligence works. And Carol Dweck wrote a great book, and many of you may have read it, I don't know, excuse me, called Mindset. And she talks about a fixed and a growth mindset, with the growth mindset being the idea that you think your intelligence can continue to grow. So you can challenge yourself, you can learn from mistakes, you can get feedback, and that's kind of how you approach learning. That's where we would love our kids to be. Unfortunately, what I see is this mindset is on a continuum. So you've got growth mindset over here, fixed mindset over here, and they tend to be more on this fixed mindset side, somewhere on that side of the continuum. And how they're thinking about their intelligence is, I'm as smart as I am. And once I've hit my limit, it's over. And so now they're getting this feedback that, you know, you're not as smart as you think you are, or it's not working the way you want it to. And what they do is they start to self-handicap and self-sabotage. They start not turning things in, not studying for tests, getting a really negative attitude about school. I don't like it. Externalizing, it's everybody else's fault. The test was too hard, the teacher is stupid, whatever. It's not them. But what they're doing is they're self-protecting because they don't know what else to do. If that's as smart as they can be, they don't want to take on new challenges. Putting in effort is embarrassing because all the kids they ever knew who really tried very hard weren't very smart. So that's not going to be me. Same for asking for help. Smart kids don't ask for help. They figure it out themselves. I've seen so many students sit in front of me and say, I should be able to figure this out myself. And so they get kind of shut down. So they're not really interested in asking for help. They're not really interested in receiving help. They will, and if you actually look at the brains of kids with a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, after they've been given something challenging to do and they get some feedback, the fixed mindset kid's brain actually just kind of goes dark. They're literally not listening to the feedback. They're just shutting it out. And you see the growth mindset kid, theirs is all lit up and just taking it in because they want to learn from that information. So that's a lot to say about mindset, but that is like one of the biggest hiccups I find. And it's also the place where I have to start with students because I can tell them all this other stuff. But if their mindset is in a place where they don't want help and they're not listening, it's a waste of time. So mindset's a place to start. Stress screens and sleep are 3 things that we all struggle with. So those, it's no different with students. They are negatively impacted by all those things. So I try to work with students on that too. So for us parents, are we, what role do we play in this disintegration? So clearly the achievement culture, driving our kids to check the box and kind of value themselves for being smart, that's a huge problem. But because we're in the achievement culture too, we're parenting with these really good intentions. Again, because we see the potential outcomes if we don't help our kids out, and that scares us. So we have really good intentions, but what I've learned personally and professionally is there are a lot of unintended negative consequences to us trying to help our kids too much here. So I'll quickly go through the areas where we're really well intended and it tends to not work out so well. So praising our kids, we tend to praise our kids maybe too much and also kind of for the wrong thing. So the thing we'll say to our kids since they're 2 years old and they start walking and talking and doing amazing things is, "You're so smart. You did that so quickly. Oh my gosh, you are amazing. You're the fastest kid on the team." So we are what's called person-centered praise. We're praising things that aren't really in their control. And so if they hear that from teachers and parents and grandparents and the neighbor, like for years and years and years, it's no wonder these kids have internalized, "I'm a smart kid." By the time they're, in second, third grade, they know they're a smart kid, but they identify that way. So based on what I've already told you, you can see how that can come back and be problematic when they do start to struggle. So we want to try to praise the process more. And this is really hard to do because it's just a habit to say, "You're so smart, you're so pretty, you're so fast." But what we want to say is, "Wow, I like how much effort you put into that. Oh, that's really creative." So we're really trying to focus on the process, the things they're doing, the things they do have control over, how much effort they're putting in something. We protect, shield, and shelter our kids a lot. And again, I go into this quite a bit in the book as to kind of historically how we got to the place where we're those kinds of parents. But here's how it's translated into our generation of kids now is we have a very young generation of kids. And by that, I mean like 18-year-olds are more like 15-year-olds and 15-year-olds are more like 13-year-olds, which has some pluses to it. Our kids are not as much of risk takers as previous generations. They stick close to home. They rely a lot on parents, which again, from a safety standpoint, feels really good, feels a lot better than my kids out, doing whatever. The problem is when these kids go off to college, you're basically sending this 15-year-old off to college who really hasn't had much experience taking risks, separating in a developmentally healthy way to kind of do their own thing and test the waters. And they do that on their own in college. And, so binge drinking is kind of out of control. There are just some things that aren't very, kind of, there's like a boomerang effect. It kind of gets us on the other side once they go away. We try to alleviate our kids' stress because we don't want to see them be overwhelmed, and oftentimes they are. For me, the problem is if we constantly try to alleviate their stress. For example, like you have dinner and at the end of dinner you say to your child, "Okay, would you or put the dishes in the dishwasher after dinner?" And they give you that look that like, "Oh my God, I can't even. I have homework to do. I've got so much to do." And they start to like get that donkey on the edge kind of vibe going. And you're just like, and fine, I'll do it. And we do it for a couple reasons. I think, part of it is you just want to avoid the whole conflict that's potentially going to happen. All of a sudden our kid wants to do homework, even though they were on their phone for 2 hours before dinner, but whatever, they're going to do homework now. So we kind of jump in and we will do that probably more often than we should. And the problem with that, the unintended consequences, if we do that a lot, what the message ends up being to our kid is, "You can't handle it. I'm going to have to do it." And, I just think about my day and there's times where I'm really stressed out and I've got a lot to do, and somebody will put something on my plate or 3 things on my plate and say, "You need to do this too." I can't just show up as a donkey on the edge and expect somebody to come take that away from me and make everything okay. So we're not giving our kids the opportunity to kind of step up and take responsibility and live life the way they're going to have to live life once they leave our houses and they're in college and they have their careers and all that kind of stuff. We help our kids more than they want and more than they need. Again, we just kind of jump in, and part of the issue here is that we're just not giving them an opportunity to make some mistakes. When we're always trying to, we're sacrificing their long-term growth for our short-term comfort. So we don't want to see them have the negative consequence. You said your kid, did you fill out that? Did you fill out your field trip form? I will. Okay. Have you filled out that field trip form yet? Yeah, I'm going to. Okay. Did you fill out the field trip form? And you keep asking, and they keep saying they're going to do it. And then we just jump in and we fill out the form for them to alleviate our stress. Instead of letting them have the consequence that if they don't do it, hey, they don't get to go on the field trip, which stinks. But if you think back in your life, what impacted you the most? What are the things you remember? And oftentimes we mess up. And it's those times we mess up where it's like, yeah, I'll never do that again. I really learned something important. And I think we're not giving our kids enough of that experience, unfortunately. We indulge our kids. I'd go into this more in the book about kind of differentiating between their wants and their needs. And the other thing that we do as parents is we tend to prioritize others, particularly our kids, over ourselves. And, that's just a problem, because if our tank's empty, then we don't really have a lot to give, or not a lot of good stuff to give to others. And, I feel like we've all probably been in the position of, giving a lot of ourselves to somebody else, usually a family member, at a cost. And sometimes that cost is, your mental or physical health, your marriage, your job. There's a lot on the line, and it takes intention to kind of stop and say, I need to prioritize myself. I called it being selfish. So I explained to my kids I was going to be more selfish, and I wasn't going to drop everything for them when they needed it, need. And it kind of, it transformed our relationship, because they realized I had a life, which seemed kind of surprising to them, that I had stuff that was priority for me. And we started interacting in a very different way. They'd start saying things like, would you mind bringing me this if that works in your schedule? Or can you do carpool this day if that works in your schedule? And it was like, now I really kind of wanted to help them because of the way they were allowing me to make the choice and the way they were acting me. It was very respectful. So that was kind of cool. So we've all, I'm sure, the parents on here are guilty of all those things I just mentioned. We may have done it 10 minutes ago, yesterday. We'll probably do it tomorrow. No exception here. And I say that because I feel like sometimes when you hear somebody talk about parenting, the parenting expert, which there's no such thing, but that you walk away feeling like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or you feel guilty about doing something, or wish you could undo something. And, that is just, I felt that way, and it's just not okay. It's not okay, because we are showing up in the best version of ourselves every day, loving our kids, doing everything we can in the best way we know how in the moment. So I share all that stuff to say, here, it helps to know about it. It helps to know how these well-intentioned things can come back to be a problem later, and we can just work on it. So all I think you should take away from that is it's something to work on. And one of the best ways to get to work on kind of tweaking our relationship with our kids, particularly as they get older, is building trust with our kids. And my way of doing that was, I had a sticky note on my mirror for a couple years that said, it's not about me. And it was a reminder to take that deep breath and not be so reactive in my kind of stress response over what my kids were or were not doing, and trying to meet them where they are, not where I thought they should be or where I wanted them to be, and to try to um, think about what they needed from me in the moment, more so than what I needed from them. And that is a really hard pivot. And parenting is full of hard pivots. You know, you go from having an infant that you parent one way, and then you get this toddler, and it's like a whole new ball game. It's like, oh man, I was just getting this whole infancy thing down, and now the kids all over the place, and now the kids talking. And adolescence is no different than like toddlerhood. The difference is how we approach our kids at that stage of the game. So when they're toddlers, we're really excited about them making mistakes and trying things and trying to walk, and we don't try to help as much, or intervene or alleviate this, or we're letting them make mistakes and learn from them. And we change as parents when they become teenagers because the stakes become really high. And what we should be doing is parenting like we did those toddlers, like, all right, I'm here to support you if you're going to take a huge fall, but you go for it. I trust you. You can do this. Your brain is meant for this. Your body is meant for this. And we don't tend to do that. Um, it's if there's one thing that you could work on, like after you get off here, like a big takeaway, it would be improving communication in your family, because all families, we all need this, because it's an ongoing process. And particularly as our kids get older, the heavy lifting um, falls on the parents. So kids are not going to come and say, we need to have a talk about this, let's get on the same page. They're not going to do that. So one of the ways to improve communication is we need to zip it. And this is really, really hard for me because I'm like a born problem solver. It's what I do. That's how my brain works. You come to me and you're all upset or whatever. I'm like, okay, have you tried this? Here's a thought. What about this? That is the last thing our kids want or need. They want us to zip it, and they want us to listen empathetically, which means they want us to hear what they're saying from their perspective. So you have to kind of get out of your, for me, 50 something brain and get into their, 12-year-old brain or 14-year-old brain. What is happening? What are they thinking here? And we have to reflect back to demonstrate we understand. So if our kids like just spewing out all this stuff, and we can say, it sounds like you're really hurt that your friend, took your notebook and threw it on the floor today, or whatever the thing is that they're talking about. And then your job is to listen, to hear, yeah, I'm really upset. I'm really disappointed. I'm mad. Just let those emotions come out, but get the validation that you do understand. And right there, that is communication. Because what you've done is you've actually buffered your kid from that adversity, because you understood, you listened, and you cared. And that is the most valuable thing that we bring to the table as adults in kids' lives. It is the most protective thing that we do. It's really kind of the easiest. We're just not in the habit of doing it all the time. So that is the one place I would say focus the most on, is just improving that communication. And out of that will come cooperative problem solving. So we want to try to adopt what's called an authoritative parenting style, which is a high warmth, high structure parenting style based on respect, so that there are expectations, there are rules, but there are conversations. So you get the child's input, you give them feedback. It's a back and forth, respectful kind of dialogue that will really buffer your relationship in many, many ways. And finally, we have a superpower as adults in kids' lives, particularly as parents, and that is modeling. So I call it living out loud, but our kids, since the second they have been born, have been watching us very, very, very closely. They listen to us, but more so they are watching us and they pay attention to what we do. So we can say everything we want to say. If we're not walking the walk, they notice. So that means things like if you're on your kid about their phone use or gaming or whatever, and if we can't demonstrate that we can do it. So if we say, no phone at the dinner table, yet we're pulling ours out under the table and doing it, the words "no phone at the dinner table" don't mean much to our kids when we're not doing what we're asking them to do. So one of the best ways to get our kids not to use tech at certain times is for us not to use tech at certain times. If you don't want your kid to use their phone while they're driving, once they get their license, don't use your phone while you're driving because they're watching. And if they're little and then they turn 16, you're like, well, you can't have a phone. And they'll be like, well, wait a minute. Why did you drive with a phone? And then we say things like, well, I'm more experienced and blah, blah, blah. It's much more powerful if we walk the walk here. And I would say one of the things we can really help our kids with here is that growth mindset. So I'm a former fixed mindset kind of person, probably into my 40s. So I've been messing around with a growth mindset for maybe 10 years, which is kind of awesome. But when I decided to write the book, because that's why would I write a book? Who am I to write a book and tell people stuff? I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking at the time. I did that out loud in front of my family, in front of my kids, because I was slipping into fixed mindset. I was feeling like super vulnerable. I was feeling like I didn't want to take this challenge. I wasn't sure I wanted to put the effort into it. Definitely wasn't sure I wanted any kind of feedback or criticism. So I felt myself slipping. And so I decided I had a big whiteboard in the kitchen. I would just put stuff up there and I would just basically out loud tell how I was feeling about things, or say I felt vulnerable, say this was stressful, say what I was worried about, where I made mistakes, where things worked out well. And my kids were watching. And I think it was good for me because it pulled me back onto that growth side, but it was great for them too, because they got to see that, we all struggle with that kind of stuff, and you can see the progress that somebody makes. So anything you can do like that to live out loud, I think is great. And just on that note of growth and fixed mindset, if you are thinking, wow, my kid has a fixed mindset, try to find a place, a thing that they do where they have a growth mindset. And sometimes it's like the sports they're involved in or their extracurricular, playing an instrument, being in some sort of club, that there's some place where they approach, the challenge is great. They put in the effort. They love the feedback. It's demonstrating growth because that helps them understand how they're not applying that to school. So I think that's a really good kind of hack for parents and somebody like me to use with a student, is to be like, oh, but look how you do lacrosse. That's so different from how you think about math. So bringing everything full circle, what I'd love to see from achievement culture standpoint is that we tweak that definition of success from one that's so data driven and check the box to one that's more values driven, where we're valuing curiosity and learning and growth and resilience, because that's really what we want in our kids. And that's where that joy of learning comes from. So it's like turning, a big old cruise ship. It's not going to happen quickly. But I think each of us in our own family has the power to help buffer our students from the current achievement culture and make small, small inroads where we can slowly start to turn the big ship and get back to a good place um, in education, because we know how to educate our kids. We're really good at it. We've just kind of lost our way with what we're valuing in education. So that's kind of that's overview of the book. And I'd love to connect with any of you guys. Those are my places. Um, and I'd also love to hear your thoughts, your questions. Just have a conversation with you now. I appreciate you taking the time and listening to me. I'll stop sharing my screen here. There we go.
My head is spinning. That is so much information to
I
take in.
know I
It's so
talk a lot.
it's so exciting. And I'm so glad that there's a roadmap going forward. Because there's so much pressure that, as again, we were talking in the green room, some pressures, you were talking about how the student perceives that there's a lot of pressure and expectations being put on them, which is exactly what happened to me. It became my identity to be the smart one. And I said, well, I have to maintain that. I have to be the smart one. None of the adults actually pushed me
Mhm.
to maintain my grades. They were just like, oh, well, good job, but none of them were saying you have to get these grades. I did that all to myself. I didn't notice it. My parents had no idea, that this was really an issue. And now we know how much, praise for, praising like, oh, you're so smart can really be internalized by a child. And it's very exciting to see that there are now paths forward for how to adjust this. I have a couple questions. I'm going to try not to turn this into my own personal tutoring
Coaching
session
session.
for how do I prevent doing this to my own children. To our audience members, if you do have questions that you would like to ask, please do pop them into the chat or into the Q&A. I'll start with a couple questions here. Do you have any tips on changing the mindset? You did mention bringing them to some place where they have a growth mindset, but how do you cajole them into believing that something can be changed?
That's a great question. And I call it, it's kind of like getting buy-in from, and I think it's why I've been successful in my coaching, because you can go get skills, you can go to a learning center and get, study strategies and study skills. But again, it can kind of be a band-aid, and a kid can go, yeah, okay, but they're not going to do it. So for me to get buy-in so that they will want to do the things, because they have to want to do it. I mean, parents, we have no control. Once our kids get to be tweens and teens, you can't make them eat, you can't make them learn. It's not in our control. We control the things I talked about. So trying to in my attempt to get buy-in from them always looks like, oh, I work with a lot of students, and here's what I see a lot of times. And I basically describe it as disintegrating student. And I've had students just start to cry because because they're like, how do you know that about me? Because this, like, literally, they've told no one. And here I am just going, oh, I see these kids all the time. They're a dime a dozen. And they're like, oh my God. So that really helps for them to realize that this is a common thing. And it's nothing to be embarrassed about. And it really has nothing, zero, to do with how smart you are. And that is so reassuring to them. I mean, just the relief on their face when they hear, oh, and I even tell students, because I like to talk to them about their brain and how their adolescent brain is developing. There's research that shows that during those adolescent years, the brain is really, really spongy, just like in like birth to 3. So think of all the things a baby to a 3-year-old learns to do. Well, the brain gets really, really spongy again like that and learns really quickly and really easily in adolescence. And their IQ can grow as much as 18 points, which is significant. It can also decline as much as 18 points. So, because it's malleable. So, lots of good stuff in, lots of growth. Neglect, any kids who get involved with drugs and alcohol too early, and when that brain's real spongy, it learns addiction really well. And those kids tend to have, a more difficult problem managing that as they get older. So I think kids really feel empowered when they start to understand their brain, when they start to understand, what are the limitations, what aren't the limitations. So that's kind of a cool place to start.
I'm going to say that my inner 12-year-old also did feel relief to hear what you just said, that this is very common. And I'm like, it wasn't just me. And that was decades ago, but 12-year-old me just had that moment. It's like, it wasn't you.
Oh,
It wasn't you.
wasn't you?
So next time you see this book, there's going to be like all these little post-it notes fall through. So another thing I wanted to talk about is you did mention how parents have the mindset of let them fail, stress test themselves when the child is a toddler. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Because when my children were toddlers, I remember my in-laws being like, oh, they're going to fall. And I'm like, well, they're going to fall onto like the soft, cushy, floor, and they've got like a thick diaper on. So they're going to fall on their bum. If you see their head falling, yes, maybe stick your head there, but let them fall on their bum because they're learning their bodies. And now that my children are older, I'm just like, oh, well, like, don't do that now. And that is a really wonderful way to reframe it, that we did do this when they were younger. And so can you give some examples of stress testing that that we can do with our kids to teach them their own resiliency? You gave the example of the field trip form. Are there household responsibilities or ways? I mean, do you let them not put away their laundry and then they don't have any, like they don't have the purple shirt? Or
Yes. I mean, what a great natural consequence. It's not life altering. It's like you can't wear your favorite jeans because you didn't wash them. Okay. That probably won't happen again in the future. So in the book, I actually have developmentally age appropriate household responsibilities by age to kind of get kids started. And laundry is a great one because you can start that really young, from like just helping carry to the laundry machines, to learning to sort, to doing it themselves. And yeah, so I think that's a great thing. Oh, I was going to say something else, but my nighttime brain, I felt it just fly away.
gone. Goodbye, thought.
Oh, I know, it's terrible. Oh, I know what it was. It came back to me. Thank you. My own daughter, my youngest, really bright, really not a fan of school. She had a chronic illness. She got diagnosed in like 4th grade. Things went down. She was the smartest kid in class, missed 80 days of school, came back, didn't feel like the smartest kid anymore. And,
And there's
struggles.
that identity of the smart kid that has now been threatened.
Huge. And she's huge fixed mindset at that point. I can tell you now, she's at college. She's doing all the things I wish she would have done years ago that I thought she might be capable of, but she never showed me. But she's doing great, has a growth mindset, all that kind of good stuff. But our agreement was, because we were just going to keep coming to blows over this, starting freshman year, you're in charge. You can graduate, you can not graduate. You can take the AP classes or not. And it was hard. And there were ups and downs. And I'm not going to say it went like, but that girl, she pulled it out. She did a great job in high school. She had, she could have done better. She certainly underperformed, but she got into the college she wanted to get into. She wants to be a teacher. Go figure. So all that to say, that was her opportunity. When it came to college, she had to fill out her applications. I have no idea what any of my kids put on any of their college applications for like their essay. I never read any of them, but I wasn't going to college. I already did that. And I was happy to read them if they wanted me to, but it was always like, this is your thing. And by giving our kids that control, so it can be applying to college, it can be doing laundry, it can be emptying waste baskets. Whatever it is, we're saying, we trust you. You've got this.
You know, that reminds me of a story. My child, my oldest child, one of his chores that he very much actually enjoys doing is emptying waste baskets. But he doesn't really check what he's picking up. And we use grocery bags as old grocery bags as our trash can liners. But a friend gave us new curtains to take home. She's like, oh, I redecorated. Buddy, do you want these curtains? Oh yeah, those are cool. They'd look great in my room. She put them in a grocery bag. And we brought him upstairs. We put him next to his door. We were going to set him up. He gathered the garbage. He didn't pay attention to what he was doing. And then we were like, where are the curtains? So, but you're right. It's natural consequences. It wasn't like he didn't get in trouble. He was doing his own chore. And it was like, well, I'm not going to punish you for this.
But see, that's the perfect way to approach that, because what he learned, that's one of those mistakes. It's like, oh, maybe I should double check before I throw out the bags. I mean, without that experience.
And it's hard to try and punish a child for over enthusiasm in chores. So
Absolutely.
it was like, okay, all right, we're just gonna, we'll just go find you new curtains.
Well, it would also shut them down if you did. So he would no longer enjoy doing that, and probably wouldn't want to do other things, because then you're going to make me feel bad about myself because I'm not going to do it right. And when we get on our kids about making mistakes, which we should expect that they're going to do, I mean, they're going to ruin some clothes in the laundry. They're going to break some things when they're dust. It's going to happen. And the world that we've done it, and we felt, I can remember knocking something over and just, having that reaction where you're just like, oh my gosh, I've just done the worst thing in the world, and you feel terrible. And, that doesn't really help anything.
Yep. And punishing enthusiasm is so crushing. So
yeah,
don't punish enthusiasm and let them. So what I'm getting from this tonight is let them make their own mistakes, but be there to catch them, so that they don't whack their head, maybe just get them so that they fall on the diaper,
But it's really it's a normalizing failure and mistakes it's like this is a normal part. This is part of learning. So I would even suggest at dinner time, but for a while, my family and I, when I was trying to push my kids more towards that growth mindset, was, who made the biggest mistake today? We made it a competition at dinner. Because everybody's so embarrassed, and so even in the family, the kids were competitive, and it wasn't pretty. I didn't like it. So it was like, okay, who screwed up the most today? Bring it.
I like that. I like that a lot. I'm gonna be starting that tomorrow night at dinner.
There you go.
We are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Jeannine Jannot. She is the author of The Disintegrating Student, which is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We do happily ship books to you, or you can pick it up in store, curbside pickup, all of the above. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us tonight. I hope you learned something. And Jeannine, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
I had a great time. My friends on the school board, I'm going to be tossing this her way.
Awesome.
And I hope that this has been helpful to some of the parents out there. Thanks so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.